if in the development process, the information processing of a human being. I mean, I know fighter aircraft pilots are pretty smart guys, and they're very tuned guys, and they filter these people out. But I can't imagine that you can actually visually process all these things coming onto your face and all these sensors while you're potentially in a dogfight or while you're on a mission.
No, they don't really dogfight in these things, first of all. But yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of good points made here. I mean, the one thing I will say about the F-35, the biggest selling point on that program is its integration.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a good selling point. I mean, back when I was trying to sell that aircraft and I would go out there and, try to convince everybody that, hey, don't believe your lying eyes. Believe me, I'm telling you, this program's going to be good. This program, if you look at the F-22, you look at the F-15, you look at all these other these what we call legacy programs that have come before, they all had different sensors. It was not integrated. You had like maybe a Honeywell, radar. You had maybe a Raytheon, defense management type of system. With the F-35, there are very few buttons on that aircraft. When you look at a legacy aircraft,
yeah, it's all going through the same operating system, to use a desktop
it's going through all. I mean, that's what I've always said. Like, you have BAE Systems, which is the British outfit, and we had BAE people, in our office at that time, and we had to be careful what we said to them and everything else. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different firewalls that you had to deal with.
Well, yeah, apparently the U.S. is not giving access to the source code to any of the international partners.
No.
Which is just like, imagine sinking, not only like the amount of money that you're sinking into this airplane, but
$1.5 trillion.
The deferred opportunity cost, not just of like, oh, we could have had this plane a long time ago, but like, your pilot's training, your radar interop, everything else. And then it's like, oh yeah, and presumptively the United States can just shut this plane down, or anyone who compromises the United States government. So like,
yes. Well, if you look at Eglin Air Force Base that I went to before,
it goes the other way.
I think it's called
but go ahead. Yeah.
It's called the ISRL lab. I mean, it basically it takes all of the different like MiGs out there, tries to collect all of their different radar signatures.
C4ISR, that's like the military command acronym.
Yeah.
Command and control.
But anyway, I mean, what other option do these countries have? Like, what other option does Denmark have? They're spending like almost 100% of their budget like buying this.
I mean, it's
they
just
could have gone
a
for a
crude,
Eurofighter.
it's like a crude screw you
right?
to your erstwhile allies when you don't even allow them to run like a tested build of the software on the plane that they're running. Like, I mean, given the complexity of the thing, it's totally possible that you would be able to introduce vulnerabilities that they would realistically never discover. But just to not even give them access to the code is just like, yeah, we're going to screw you, and what are you going to do about it?
You don't even have to introduce vulnerabilities. I mean, the vulnerabilities come with a plane that's entirely integrated. I mean, if you look at the
anything
F-22...
that like does I/O and has 8 million lines of code, like ipso facto has vulnerabilities.
I think the plane altogether is like 33 million lines of code. And, I mean...
Well, that includes ALIS, right?
Yeah, that includes ALIS. Alice. I call it Alice.
You would expect
we
that
always
to
called
be
it.
the point of vulnerability interjection. Like,
But
I mean,
Alice,
they do this sort of thing with commercial plane software where it turns out, the engineers designing it didn't really anticipate that the call would be coming from inside the house. So it's possible to get basically you can get a line from something like the USB charge port on the in-flight entertainment to the actual plane software.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Alice, I'll tell you this much about Alice. This was 2013, and I was chosen to be. And I'd already been doing a whole bunch of site activation out at Yuma to try to get them prepared for this aircraft. And it finally arrived out there, and we were having trouble with the tires. And it's still a problem to this day. Like, most of my day was taken up with having to solve tire problems. Like, it's not just the software, it's the whole plane itself. I mean, it's terrible. And then, with the Alice, I mean, the Alice has gone through a whole lot of different iterations with it. You had Alice 1.03, you had Alice 2.01. When I got to Yuma, we were working off Excel spreadsheets. That's how bad.
That happens everywhere. I mean, people they try to go in and sell these complicated, we're going to solve everything, one ring to rule them all software packages for your company. And
then you realize you've been talking to Microsoft the same time, and they're just trying to replace Excel 2003 with Excel 2006.
But Excel works, and that people understand it, and that's what ends up happening, because if you bite off more than you can chew, these programs just get dusted. They just sit there, and then people start relying on spreadsheets again.
This reminds me of when I was a wee intern for a company. Another project that I was not involved with, but I was sitting next to engineers and contractors who were working on implementing Oracle Hyperion, which is a very complex.
Wait, what happened to Fusion? Is that what happened after Fusion? I don't know. I hate that company, but yeah, please.
I don't know. But anyways, and Oracle Hyperion, Oracle itself, it's terrible reputation, overly complex software. Hyperion in particular was very, very complicated. At one point, they were flying out specialized contractors from Utah, I think of all places, every week to come into the office and work on this project to get Hyperion implemented. And this is when I was in university. I left the internship to go back to university, but I had a friend there who continued, who was a full-time employee. And he told me that maybe 4 or 5 months later, they abandoned the project entirely after they had sunk maybe almost a year's worth of time, millions of dollars, into trying to get this going. And they went with a very small HR management system and Excel. They were using Excel dashboards just to streamline this whole process. And they found that it worked for them because they weren't that big a company. They didn't really need Hyperion, but it seemed like they did at the time, and they kept believing that they could make this work, that it would make the company really valuable, that it could really help with a lot of problems, and they sank a ton of time into integrating proprietary code and proprietary APIs, and proprietary data sources into Hyperion, and ended up just literally gave up. Had to basically call it quits because it was becoming too complex. The code management was becoming too complicated. They were talking about having to hire 3 QA people just to test that there were no security vulnerabilities, that the data was accurate. There was potential that if they integrated this with their with what they were using for healthcare, it could give the wrong information to the wrong person. It could be a total calamity from an HR standpoint. They had to give up. And this happens consistently with big software projects. And I know you're talking about from a hardware problem, tires just not working. Maybe, early on in the episode, you mentioned that the maintenance on these planes is really the crux of the problem. Software maintenance, hardware maintenance, supply chain maintenance. In what you've seen, why is the maintenance so difficult? Is it just because there's so many parts and it's so difficult to coordinate 10 different manufacturers in 3 different software engineering outfits just to get a plane updated and hardware maintenance getting going.
Well, I mean, I would say, I mean, with this program, like after you had the consolidation, of all the major defense contractors, I mean, those companies really didn't go away. I mean, there's a lot of mom and pop places out there that manufacture, specific parts, for this aircraft. And when you're trying to develop a plane that has got basically a huge flat screen TV with like maybe 12 buttons, like physical buttons on that plane, you're talking about a huge amount of integration that is just really hard to wrangle. And, like parts not fitting. I mean, good gosh, like there was a big scandal back in like 2010 with this program where they had, like $1 billion worth of parts, on this program that were in the Fort Worth warehouse that were obsolete, basically. I mean, they were basically designed for old, test planes or whatnot, because, I mean, you have to keep the test planes going. I mean, that is the one thing that Lockheed is really good at, is trying to keep these test planes going. And they will steal parts. When I say steal parts, I mean, they're taking parts away from another program to try to fit it on, to this program. And it's just, it's too complicated of an aircraft. I mean, it's just a maintenance nightmare. And, like when you're talking about the lines of code and everything like that, I mean, this is the plane that we're relying on our defense for. And it's pretty, I mean, it's come clear to me that this is basically, a congressional, handout to.
That's what Pierre Spray says. It's a handout to Lockheed.
Well, I've got a lot of Pierre Spray. Like I really don't take a lot of credit. I don't really think highly of him. But
I'm with you. I think he's a lot of hot air sometimes. But to that point,
he's on RT all the time, and
of course,
some of the stuff that he says is just completely complete garbage.
He likes being on camera.
I mean,
he comes from that generation, like you mentioned earlier about him
fighter mafia,
having this weird hatred for multi-role aircraft. He comes from that boomer generation where there was a real philosophy. We could, and especially after World War II, we could design an aircraft for every single specific purpose, because the world was their oyster. And from an engineering and resource management standpoint, there was no limit. You could do whatever you wanted. And so you could design specific aircraft and specific models of each aircraft for specific jobs. And it wasn't a big deal if you had to decommission them 2 years later because they weren't worthwhile anymore. I think that a lot of the stuff with Pierre Spray really comes from him. I think he has some good points. I've seen some of his stuff every now and then on the program, but a lot of it just comes from he simply just comes from an old generation that really doesn't understand the constraints for war.
Well, I mean, here's the thing about Pierre Spray is he didn't like whenever he gets introduced, he always said, "I designed the A-10 and the F-16."
Yeah,
that right there,
he
was a government. Yeah. He was a government employee, and I've looked up on his biography. He was a statistician. Like, that's not the way the government works. You hire contractors to go out there and build and design stuff. And he's going out there and taking credit for, like, I designed and built the F-16. And nobody, they introduce him as that, and he doesn't, contradict them at all. And that's just really, that right there just showed that I really can't trust this guy.
In 2011, Robert Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense, put the program kind of on probation or something. Didn't put it on ice, but put it on probation.
Well, I think he fired one of the directors at the Defense Department also.
EDC.
Hines, General Hines.